Hello again. This is the last of your 3 videos on the GVC acceleration project. So this video will complete your training. The last thing we're going to talk about is breaking down standards. We're going to start with the essential standards and then talk about supporting standards. So what we're going to do when we look at this is basically we're going to take a look at these 4 steps, and then we're going to flip back and forth into how that looks on an actual standard and how we would unpack or unwrap a standard. Same thing. When we say unpack, when we say unwrap, we mean the same thing. The first thing that you're going to do is underline or emphasize the action verb in the standard, as this verb will dictate the level of rigor the standard requires. So what are the students actually doing? So in this standard, which is obtain, evaluate, and communicate information about how the use of chemistry-related technologies have had positive and negative ethical, social, economic, and/or political implications. Again, a very intensive standard, a lot of different components to this, so we definitely want to make sure we break this down into learning targets, but before we can write learning targets, we need to know what the students have to do. So the verbs here, obtain, evaluate, and communicate, are all around the information there. So we're going to want to make sure that we isolate those terms and that we use those when we're writing our essential learning targets. The next thing we're going to do is determine if the specific standard skills are clear as written or if unpacking is needed. So we're going to talk about now all the basically the nouns in the sentences. So what needs to be isolated and what do we need to make sure that we are teaching through the skill that the students need to be doing. So one note here is to be cautious of over or underpacking a skill. So we don't want to break the standard down too small so that it's no longer actually reflecting the proficiency of the standard, but we also don't want to keep the standard as is if it's a large and cumbersome standard that we can't realistically assess. So here, you're going to see we're looking for what information do they need to actually be able to obtain, evaluate, and communicate. Okay, they need to be able to obtain, evaluate, and communicate information on chemistry-related technologies and their outcomes in society, including ethics, social, economic, and political implications. So we're going to see these now at the bottom. Again, another note is be clear in your understanding of how this standard would be taught and assessed. So when you're looking at this and you're bumping back and forth here trying to write learning targets, we really want to ensure that we know how we're going to teach and assess this. So if it's something that you get to the point where you're like, man, it is way too cumbersome to be able to assess this and actually know if students understand it at this level, then it probably needs to be broken down a little further. So the last thing here is to make sure each of those learning targets is a complete skill statement on its own. And again, do not stray from that language that's written in the standards. So again, the examples here are our essential learning targets. I can obtain information directly from the standard about the use of chemistry-related technologies. Okay, so we've taken one part of this, obtaining information and chemistry-related technologies, and just broken up the first part. This on its own is a skill statement. I can see if students can do this or not. Next, I can evaluate information. Again, the verbs directly from the standard. I can evaluate information about the use of those technologies. So they're saying, okay, I can obtain this information. So students know how to gather that information. They know how to evaluate it, which is a higher rigor skill, but they do need to be able to do both per the standard. And the last is they can communicate information about the use of those technologies. So again, they are using the same verbiage that we see in the actual standard and breaking down those nouns, the chemistry-related technologies, into these different components so that they can assess each different component of the standard. Now, when we're doing this, we've already talked about these other components. We talked about our why in the first video, so we talked about why we're doing this work. But again, you as a team need to define why the work is important in what you're doing, the goals you're setting, and the time based on the best practice framework that you see here and on whatever your content specialist or facilitator walks you through. Then you're going to do a quick needs assessment. So you're going to look over the state of the guaranteed and viable curriculum and kind of see what needs to be done moving forward, what is already done. Your content specialist or facilitator will have a good idea of this already, so make sure that you touch base with them. Then you're going to do the work that we talked about in the last video, selecting essential standards. So you're selecting and then you're breaking them down, which is what we are talking about in this video. One quick note on this, and this is super important. Best practice says for a year-long course, we should have about 8 to 12 essential standards with 1 to 3 learning targets per standard. So again, for a year-long course, you should have 8 to 12 essential standards with 1 to 3 learning targets per standard. Now, if some of you are thinking that is a very small number, remember, again, we are only talking about the bare minimum for students to learn at a high level. So we are only looking at the essentials. That's not all that you'll teach. That's not all students will learn in your class, but these are the components that we are absolutely guaranteeing for every single one of our students. The last thing that we'll do is, based on this essential standard work, the selection and breaking those down, we're going to create resources. This will mainly be done during Summer PD Academy. Some of your teams may get to this during your GVC acceleration time, but this is more of a looking towards the future lens that we'll have. So some next steps. After you have done this work, you're going to consolidate those resources, send them to your content specialist or facilitator. They should walk you through this process. Then you're going to talk about how you're going to ensure that these teachers are able to understand the work that was done. So if someone wasn't involved in this small curriculum group, how am I going to make sure they still understand and they still know what work was done? And then what work is next in line for Summer PD Academy? So basically, these are all conversations you're going to have, and communicate this with the person leading your group, your content specialist or facilitator. Your next step in this process, after you've watched our 3 videos, is to go to the content debrief with your content specialist or facilitator, reach out to them directly, or reach out to edservices@awafria.org. Again, we are so thankful and so excited that you're going to be involved in this work. We are very much looking forward to all the work that is done and seeing all this great insight into our curriculum for all of our students. And there are resources for doing all of this stuff that we walked through in here. Again, to access this presentation, bit.ly/GVC Accelerated. Thank you so much for your time, and we cannot wait to see what is done. Thank you.